And we're back for the second episode of the Argentine Prison Museum in Buenos Aires. I just had a cappuccino and a media luna, so I'm very much in a Buenos Aires kind of mood to continue our commentary on the emergence of penology in Argentina. We left off with an analysis of church and state and how those forces interact. I'm going to remind you of some of the semiotics. The opening photograph features this design as a foreshadow to what we might witness on the interior of this prison museum. And here we are. Does not disappoint. The chapel. As a prison, as a correctional institution, this was governed by Mother Superior and her team of sisters. And so it blended religious instruction with vocational training, with correctional techniques to transform these young women into law-abiding citizens who would become productive and could contribute to the community. And now we are going to absorb this architecture. In this courtyard, we see a lot of semiotic activity. And we're going to do a little Foucault along with Durkheim. Durkheim reminds us of the socio-religious dimensions of culture. And Foucault is reminding us of power. And by way of Jeremy Bentham, we have evidence before us of the omniscient deity. God is everywhere. That's panoptic. Jeremy Bentham was very much interested in incorporating this concept of the omniscient deity, that God is everywhere, into penal architecture in the form of the panopticon. But it's expressed in other forms of architecture. Obviously, religious architecture. The dome of the chapel. You have the cross on the top of the dome. The omniscient deity. God is everywhere. God is everywhere. God is overlooking the courtyard, and so on and so forth. I remember when I was a kid, my mom was very keen to keep me from getting into trouble, which was a full-time job, especially when I have many brothers and sisters. And so she said to me when I was a wee kid, at one point, she said, "Michael, I'm not always going to be there to keep an eye on you, but just remember, God is always watching you." And I thought, wow, that's brilliant. That is the omniscient deity. And even as a young kid, I realized that parenting and the use of panopticism by suggesting that we're all being watched is just one of the many features of modern society and surveillance. And that's the point I'm making, is the omniscient deity is the vehicle by which we internalize the gaze, the realization that we're being watched, that we're under surveillance. So I spent a lot of time in this courtyard absorbing its architecture and the significance of the chapel. More about that later. The omniscient deity. This is the parish, San Pedro. This is next to the prison. They are separated by bricks and mortar. This is not one contiguous floor plan. These are separate buildings and institutions. However, the omniscient deity is with us. The bell towers of San Pedro are also adorned with the cross. There's a beautiful photograph of all the photos that we've seen in this series. I have taken all of them except those that we're seeing at the Argentine Prison Museum. I have to give credit to Melissa. And Melissa was extremely helpful in getting us through this tour that became a little bit more complicated because we had to deal with the management and administration of the prison museum to gain further access. That's a story within a story. But let's move on, because these socio-religious features figure prominently in the life of these prisoners. Now we're inside the chapel, which has its own set of dynamics. I had to keep from genuflecting when I walked into here because it is so sacred. Again, Durkheim, the sacred, the profane. And this chapel is separating itself from the punitive environment, which is the profane. Philip Smith at Yale University does an excellent job in his book on culture and punishment to remind us of these forces, the sacred and the profane, and how they interact and how they separate. They separate us, dividing space into a sacred place and a profane place, a place that is polluted. And here we see the inner chapel. There's a lot going on. Let me take a moment to interpret what's happening here. Museum studies, lighting. In museum studies, we recognize source of lights, and what I'm circling with the cursor here is this backlight. These statues are, this particular station for this statue is elevated. Now you have, so to give you a better look at what's going on here, you have Joseph, you have Mary with baby Jesus, and you have Jesus, and you have Mary with baby Jesus, and you have Joseph with baby Jesus. But the significance of the Virgin Mary is paramount, as expressed in this particular altar, because it's backlit and it's elevated. When objects are elevated, they project a greater sense of importance. You also see this significance of the state of Argentina with the Argentine flag, which is positioned behind the altar. Once again, separation of church and state. However, we see the merging of the church and state. The state is drawing on the power of the church to gain legitimacy. That's very important. The state draws on the power of the church to elevate its importance and its legitimacy. And we see the crucifix here. As I mentioned, I went to Catholic schools, and as a little kid, we would tell jokes, because when you're raised Irish Catholic, you better have a sense of humor. And as little kids, we would say, yeah, Jesus, he went into a hotel and he put 3 nails on the counter and says, can you put me up for the night? It's just a joke. More semiotics in the form of humor. This is the chapel. And here we see San Pedro. And he is overlooking, this is my interpretation, he is overlooking the institution. And my interpretation, from Durkheim's socio-religious perspective, as well as my own background in the Catholic faith, suggests that San Pedro is looking at the prison as an institution that is divinely ordained. This institution has the blessing of the church and the deity. That is a very important interpretation of the Argentine Prison Museum. The curators put these objects together to convey a message about what I think they're trying to say is the prison as divinely ordained. And the model serves as a vehicle for that institution. Let's go back, because I've got one more comment before we take another pause. The prison is a symbol of order. Symmetry oftentimes figures into the design, so that the overall thrust of the design and its purpose is to establish order. And prisoners are confined in an environment where there is order. Total institutions, Irving Goffman, rules, regulations, timetables, to reform, transform this prison through a regime, a regimen of power and order, to be released back into a society that is also built on the notion of order. Take a pause, and we'll be back.